Gotta be flexible, right? Gotta shift. Okay, I need everybody to stand up. Thank you for cooperating. Stand up, stand up, stand up. Twist, twist, twist. Good. Deep breath. Let it out. Now you can have a seat. I just need you to be awake because it's tough to talk to an audience at this time of day. All right, so we're talking about lenses, right? I didn't think about using that metaphor, but I'm going to borrow it, Dr. Taylor. Thank you very much. And Ms. Liu, I'm going to borrow that lens. I'm going to talk through the lens about public policy. And I'm not speaking specifically about the School of Public Policy. Dr. Sugimoto would do that. But I'm going to talk about public policy as a discipline and a practice and a profession that helps us to humanize STEM. So from the micro to the macro, public policy helps us humanize STEM, whether the perspective of an individual or the perspective of a large group, even a nation. Public policy compels us to consider the impact of science, technology, and engineering advancements on human beings. What are the costs? What are the benefits? Let me give you 3 quick examples of a public policy conundrum involving the lives of human beings. A new innovative medical procedure, life-saving, groundbreaking, earth-shattering in medicine, extremely costly. Who bears the cost for that procedure? The patient, the medical system, the insurance network, a government, or should it be shared by all parties in some form or fashion? Global warming. Developed nations are racing to decarbonize their transportation sectors because it's one of the major sources of greenhouse gas emissions that's driving climate change. We all know that. But what are the responsibilities of those developed nations to the peoples and the ecosystems of the lesser developed nations who are paying a steep price for the extraction and refinement of the critical minerals that are needed to drive the decarbonization agenda? Third one, local communities, it's particularly true in America, I don't know about other countries, but local communities in America are beginning to experience pressures on their energy and water systems as more data centers crop up. But those data centers are growing and making demands on local water and energy systems in response to our desire for increased digitization. We want it more for our convenience and for our way of living. How do we balance these two? So, switch tracks. Late 18th century America, and a gentleman named Count Alexis de Tocqueville has traveled this fledgling nation and observed this new democracy, this United States. And in observing, he wrote a thought in a book that he prepared, and he said, there are no individual rights that are so unimportant that they can be sacrificed to the arbitrariness with impunity. There are no individual rights in this country that are so unimportant that they can be sacrificed to arbitrariness with impunity. And what was he talking about? He was talking about how we have valued individual rights. It's a sacrosanct bedrock in our concept of democracy as a country, right? And we have had conflicts over it. We have struggled to try to perfect it through the years, to try to come closer to matching those founding words that said, we find these truths to be self-evident, that all men, sorry ladies, all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among them the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So, individual rights is sacrosanct. And yet, as a society, in this country and others like us around the world, we believe in trying to spread the benefits of progress to as many people as possible, and not just hoard it for a select few, right? We want to spread the benefits of progress, including the progress that's made in science, engineering, and technology developments. And so, one of my favorite characters in pop culture Comes from an old science fiction series named Star Trek. You probably don't know anything about that. And that character's name is Mr. Spock. And Mr. Spock, who's a Vulcan, in a moment of crisis at one time, talks to his captain, James Tiberius Kirk, and he says, "Captain, logic dictates that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few." Now, Mr. Spock was a Vulcan, not a human, so what does he think? You know? And of course, that whole situation was fictitious, but we all recognize that there's a thread of profound truth in that we have experienced in our country and perhaps even with ourselves, that there are times when we feel the rights of the many need to outweigh the rights of the few. And so we have these two paradigms. De Tocqueville, individual rights are absolutely supreme. Spock, no, the world should work according to the needs of the many, not the few. How do we make a difference? How do we decide? This is where I contend that public policy can play a critical role. It helps us in thinking about how we spread the benefits of progress to as many people as possible, including through science, technology, and engineering. But it helps us think about how we do that so that we can guarantee the rights of the few while spreading benefits to the many, or by guaranteeing progress and benefits for the few while protecting the rights of the many. But why should we care at all? We're a capitalist society. Why don't we just let markets dictate who wins and who loses? Oh, we're good capitalist people, you know. Markets should say everything, right? Let markets tell us who are winners and losers. Law of the jungle. No subsidies to help prop up anybody or induce behavior. No regulations or laws to restrict or protect anybody. But we don't do that. Why? Because as human beings, we developed a sense of fair play a long time ago. Very early in our history, we tried to encode notions of fair play into our religious traditions, our laws, our canons of ethics. Writers through the ages have tried to reflect a lot of these feelings and a lot of these conflicts we've had about how do we balance sense of fairness for different groups and protect different people. One of my favorite literary references for a sense of fair play comes from a 1986 classic, All I Need to Know, I Learned in Kindergarten, by Robert Fulton. Now, some of us are old enough to remember this. Some of you are too young to know anything about what I'm saying, but go buy the book and read it. And some of the things that Robert Fulton said are share everything, play fair, clean up your own mess, don't take things that aren't yours, say you're sorry when you hurt somebody, hold hands, and stick together. So now imagine the kind of world if we as adults could follow some of these guidelines in our own behavior. Why would we need anything else? No religion, no laws, no ethics, no anything else. Because we're going to work it out for ourselves. But unfortunately, there are some of us who really don't want to do that. And so we have developed these guardrails for our personal, our professional, and our civic behavior that we have encoded in our religious traditions and teachings, in our laws, and in our ethical codes. Our oldest professions, such as architecture, engineering, construction, and medicine, have tried to incorporate some of these notions of fair play and justice into their canons of ethics and professionalism. And that's what they try to pass down to their students of their respective disciplines. Public policy is a very recent profession. Although we can trace public policy concepts back thousands of years, as a formal profession, it didn't emerge really until after World War II, as the United States was grappling with complex problems of urban poverty, suburban mobility, integration in housing, integration in education, applying civil rights throughout our country's institutions. And then public policy arose and became a more formalize discipline and profession by combining the methods of social sciences, philosophy, history, and other social and liberal arts disciplines with quantitative techniques like econometrics, like statistics and probability, and other quantitative tools. And increasingly, decision makers at all levels of government have found that useful, very useful. But even some corporations have engaged public policy or policy analysis techniques to help them with their major resource allocation decisions or to help them with product development decisions. I'll give you two examples. Ben & Jerry's. Nobody knows anything about Ben & Jerry's ice cream, right? No, don't like it. I love it, Ben & Jerry's ice cream. Very close to their beginning, they developed a fair trade initiative. They were very interested and very concerned about being sure that the farmers who grew the products that were the sources of their raw materials and the communities that those farmers inhabited were treated fairly with a living wage, protections for their ecosystems and their environments. And so they had this fair trade program. And that helps them with the major materials that they source, their sugar, their vanilla, their cocoa, their coffee, their bananas, and more. And they continued to enhance that program through the years. Nordstrom's, another example, product development. Years ago, in trying to realize some major sustainability goals that Nordstrom set for itself, they realized that a lot of their clothing materials were not sustainable, were harmful to the environment, weren't particularly reflective of fair trade and fair labor practices. And so they launched a whole category of product items that they call responsible design. And that program is now named Sustainable Style Nordstrom's. But it was their attempt to think about how they are leveraging their power to make a better world while still providing the consumer a good. Public policy has done a lot of good things and has helped decision makers make major changes that have benefited all of us. In fact, my life and my career is reflective of some of those changes that started in the 1950s as we were beginning to open up the society to full participation by people who previously had lived on the margins. I speak specifically of African American, Hispanic American, and Asian Americans who lived in this country, and women, many of whom could not fully access educational opportunities and career opportunities that this country provided. So that public policy began to change. And so in the 1950s, shortly after I was born, my parents, who grew up and were living in deep South Georgia, decided they were going to relocate to a northern city, Cincinnati, Ohio, because the policies of the state of Ohio offered them greater access to opportunities and resources than the policies of the state of Georgia at that time. And for that reason, they were able to obtain great middle-class jobs. They were allowed to buy a good quality home in a good middle-class neighborhood, and their children could attend excellent public schools. Would not have been possible in mid-1950s in Georgia for African Americans. And so that great education that helped me prepare as a high school and elementary school education prepared me to come back to Georgia. My mother said, "You're going back? We just left." To come back to Georgia almost 20 years later, when Georgia was beginning to change its own policies and opening up its institutions of higher education to more women and to minorities. And so I don't need to tell you the story of techs opening to minorities and women beginning in the mid-60s. Let me just say that these three pioneers made it possible for me and a few years later my wife to be here. Those three made the two of us possible. And I can say without boast or without reservation that the two of us, through our careers and our contributions of time, talent, and treasure, have enhanced this institute, this city that we chose to call home, and this state tremendously. But our story is not a unique story. There are millions of people who, because of a change in policy, allowing fuller participation to society's institutions, were able to go on and get great careers, many of them in the STEM disciplines, and to make their own contributions to our country and our world. Let me tell you about 3 of them. Dr. Patricia Bath, who as a young girl dreamed of being a doctor, didn't know anything about ophthalmology, but later on in medicine, she learned about ophthalmology as a specialist, and she went on to study ophthalmology. And she was one of the very first ophthalmologists to use lasers to do cataract surgery. Very common procedure now, but she was one of the pioneers of the concept, African-American and woman. Dr. France Cordova, who studied English as an undergrad major in Stanford, didn't know the first thing about physics, could care less. But after graduating and working in the field, she witnessed the landing on the moon of the Apollo 11 space capsule. She was so inspired by that, she said, I want to know how to be a part of that. She went back to grad school, studied astrophysics, got her PhD. Later on, she became NASA's chief scientist, and then produced 11th president, and later on the 14th president of the National Science Foundation. Lastly, Alan Emtage, a name you should all memorize. Mr. Emtage created the very first internet search engine. He called it Archie. It was a play on the concept of archives. And it was a convenience tool for him, make it easier for him to search for things and get information he needed in his work. Later on, he led a committee that established the Uniform Resource Locator System, or the URL system. Sound familiar? The system that we now use, it gets deployed billions of times a day all around the world. So 3 people who, until the 1950s and early 60s, would not have had the opportunities, but for changes in policy about how we allow wider, fuller participation in our society. And they have changed our world profoundly, as have millions of others. Public policy has brought about profound changes. As I've said, it allowed a wider, more diverse group of people into the American story, in fact, into the whole human story. And it also enabled us to go into the many professions of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. It places people at the center of considerations of how best to maximize the benefits of new STEM developments and discoveries, and engages us in optimizing and trying to balance the needs of the many versus the rights of the few, or the needs of the few versus the rights of the many. It is a tool and only a tool, but one I argue we should be employing more frequently, with more authenticity and more honesty. From the micro to the macro, public policy compels us to place humans at the center of all of our STEM considerations. It humanizes STEM. Thank you.
Our final respondent this afternoon, please join me in welcoming Cassidy Sugimoto, who serves as school chair, Tom and Marie Patton chair, and a professor in the School of Public Policy.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Doug, for that powerful and compelling commentary about the value and necessity of public policy for responsible science and technology innovation. Your comment about centering on the human resonates with me and the work that we're doing at the School of Public Policy. The vision of the School of Public Policy is a world in which our public leaders make evidence-based decisions, ethical decisions, with a lens towards equity, innovation, and sustainability. And in the school, we're constantly led by 2 major questions: by whom and for whom? And let me give you an example to help illustrate this. Women are 71% more likely to be injured in a car crash and 17% more likely to die. Why? Because the cars weren't designed by women, for women, and regulators didn't consider the impacts upon women. In the 1950s, we introduced crash test dummies in car testing, and they were built around a 50th percentile male. It wasn't until the 1980s that researchers started to suggest that maybe we should introduce a female-typed cast dummy, a 50th percentile female. But manufacturers and regulators ignored this advice, and it wasn't until recent decades that we introduced a female-typed crash dummy. Except she wasn't really female-typed. She was a male body that was scaled down to 4 foot 8 inches tall, 105 pounds, and then placed in the passenger seat. So if any of you women out there are outside the dimensions of 4 foot 8, 105 pounds, or forbid you drive the car, you are not compliant with the way the car was manufactured. You are out of compliance, and the car is therefore not a tool for you to use. This is even more severe for pregnant women, for whom very, very little testing has been done, despite the fact that car crashes are a leading cause of fetal death. The cars weren't designed by women. The cars weren't designed for women, and regulators weren't considering the impacts upon women. So at the School of Public Policy, these are the kinds of conversations we engage in. And we begin with that question that was raised by Doug: who gets to be a scientist? Who gets to be an engineer and an entrepreneur and a disruptor? Who gets to ask those questions and build our new innovations? My research, for example, finds that this matters. Female scientists in the biomedical sciences are much more likely to ask questions about the female body. And we find that this covers across all areas of inquiry, not just the biomedical sciences, but all sciences. People bring their lived experiences to the questions that they ask, to the innovations that they develop, to the businesses that they start. They want to solve problems that they face. Therefore, diversity in science and engineering and technology is not merely about access for those individuals. It's about changing the breadth of knowledge, about changing what we know, about what we build, and the kind of businesses that we run. Now, we can see a few examples of that in our own faculty. Lindsay Bullinger, for example, is a professor and a mother and the co-director of the Health Economics and Policy Innovation Collaborative. And she examines how public policies affect children and families and their health and well-being, particularly for low-income families. Now, she finds, for example, that the introduction of a SNAP store reduces child maltreatment by nearly 5%. And that raising the minimum wage by $1, just $1, can reduce child neglect by 10% and teenage pregnancy by 2%. And I want you to consider that for a minute. Would you be willing to accept $1 increase in the minimum wage if we could reduce child neglect by 10%? These are the types of questions that we ask in the School of Public Policy. Now, we understand and we teach our students that these are complicated issues. They're not single variable issues, but they are the intersection of multiple aspects of policy. And this is the underlying organization of our Center for Urban Research, where we take as its theme that we have to look at the intersection of all areas of policy in order to improve the human condition. Now, this is co-directed by Professors Brian Ahn and David Edwards, and in partnership with the Mayor's Office. And that partnership is essential in order to ask those questions that drive us. For example, Brian Ahn looks at housing. He looked at over 1 million home sales in the city of Atlanta, and he found that global investments were reducing home ownership, particularly for non-majority white, low-income neighborhoods in the city of Atlanta. So he began to work with our state representatives, with county appraisers, with people who are working in tax and in housing, to try to ask, how can we make our cities more affordable? How can we use the research that we know in order to improve the lives of the people who live around us? Now, it's critical that the communities themselves are engaged in these conversations. By whom are policy made? For whom are the policies made? And who do those policies primarily benefit? Now, we extend our focus not just to the city of Atlanta, but an entire state of Georgia. We're heavily engaged in Drawdown Georgia, a program that looks to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions in the state. Now, this group includes academics, but it also has a business compact, and it has a religious compact, because we understand that policies have to be done together. Sustainability is not a problem that a single sector is going to solve on its own. And at Research at Georgia Tech, we understand how new technologies are affecting this conversation. For example, Professors Dan Matisoff and Joe Bozeman looked at the introduction of electric vehicles, not just asking whether they can affect and reduce our consequences on the climate, but saying who can afford to participate in that technological innovation? Who can buy an electric vehicle? Who gets to participate in that form of sustainability? And then what are the technologies that go into that? How do we consider batteries, for example, that Doug brought up? What are the consequences for reskilling and upskilling the workforce in the United States? How will that affect local communities? And if we don't do it here, how does that affect communities abroad? And that's part of what we are thinking about, is looking at all of those implications, the equitable implications of technology development. By whom? For whom? And we provide several opportunities for our students to see the ways in which they can provide those mechanisms, how they can actually serve to improve the human condition. We support the Georgia Legislative Internship Program, where students spend a semester working directly with the Georgia General Assembly. And last year we launched GTDC, a program where students can live and work and study together in DC, working in internships that are primarily, though not exclusively, on Capitol Hill. Now, last year I was able to see our first cohort of those students, and I met with the women in that program and our women alumni. And I was struck by the incredible things that the alumni at the School of Public Policy were doing on the Hill, the changes that they had made in their careers. And at one point, an alum stopped and they said, "How many of you students thought that you could ever live in DC?" None of the students raised their hand. And they said, "Now, 4 weeks into this program, how many of you think that you could live here?" And all the hands went up, and they asked them why, and the students articulated very clearly that they now saw themselves as agents of change. They now believed that they had a voice, and that their knowledge and their expertise, what they had learned at Georgia Tech, they could actually use that to improve the human condition, to change the nation. That is an incredible transformative thing that we can do as public educators, to create an experience that makes that much of a transformative change for students, that they see a pathway that they never saw before, that they see themselves as agents of change in a way that they never believed before. Our partnership with International Affairs on that project was really important, because it made students think not only about domestic policies, but the intractable relationship between domestic and international policies. And the School of Public Policy, we've established many new relationships with international universities abroad. One of those was Universidad Externado in Bogota, Colombia, where one of our alumni actually serves as Dean of the School of Government. And we used our students from the master's program who were doing their capstone, and we put them together with master's students at Universidad Externado in Bogota, and they worked on a project together, looking at it, pulling renewables into the energy mix in the Americas. And they worked under the ambassador for Colombia to the OECD as their client. And they had to mesh with all of these issues. What does it mean to do renewable energy in Colombia? How is that different from looking at renewable energy in the US? What are the policies that both constrain and provide opportunities? What are the technologies that constrain and provide opportunities? And how does that differ across the world? And part of what we are trying to do there is to get our students to see that they are nested citizens. They're citizens in their communities, they're citizens in their state, in their nation, but also in the world. And that's the kind of framework we try to provide. So I'll end with this. Georgia Tech is committed to developing leaders who advance technology and improve the human condition. We are problem solvers, but we also imagine futures. And as Doug Hooker noted, public policy places humans at the center of scientific and technological innovation and imaginings. Public policy is inherently about you, about all of you, providing you the infrastructure you need to thrive and the regulatory frameworks that accelerate innovation in ways that are both equitable and sustainable. Now, that sounds like a pretty big task, but as we say at Georgia Tech, we can do that. So, thank you.